It was the worst of times. It was the best of times. Since the board is the ultimate ruling body for a company, the process of a board evaluating itself can be quite a challenge. Today on Zippy Point. I'm Brock Romanek, and I'm a big fan of U's. Most boards conduct regular self-evaluations of their effectiveness, typically before the nominating corporate governance committee sets the slate of director nominees ahead of the company's next annual shareholders meeting. New York Exchange listed companies are required to do so annually. Nasdaq companies are not required, but most do it because investors and proxy advisors expect it, demand it. There's no required formula for how these evaluations are conducted. It ranges widely from a director leading the process to all the way to using third parties to facilitate them. And boards sometimes dig even deeper by going further than evaluating themselves as a group to evaluating each individual's director's performance separately. About half the time, the boards conduct these individual evaluations, but that statistic can be deceptive because individual evaluations aren't worth much if they're in the form of a self-evaluation, where directors personally evaluate themselves. A more risky proposition for individual evaluations are peer evaluations, where directors evaluate each other. Not too many boards engage in this practice. Here are 7 things to consider when conducting board evaluations. 1, make it safe, but not too safe. 2, breaking up is hard to do. 3, pick the right person to facilitate. 4, change it up every few years. 5, ask the right questions. 6, ask open-ended questions. 7, follow up to see if the process worked. 1, make it safe, but not too safe. So let's be honest, board evaluations get stale pretty quickly if you do these. Churning them out year after year, not putting much thought into it, not being really productive. If your board is just going through the motions because it's required, it's a waste of time. If it's rote, it's meaningless. Capiche? And maybe that's all your board wants out of this process. They're checking a box, a governance box. If so, that's a board not really doing its job. That's a harbinger of perhaps a bigger problem, which means trouble for the company down the road. A good board valuation process, you sit down annually with the lead director to map out this year's evaluation. You ponder, what are we really trying to do this time around? Is there a specific issue, or is it just continuous improvement? Should we change up the process entirely this year? Every few years, change that up. Get an outside facilitator if you don't use one. Change your facilitator if you already have one. Make the process robust so you get a true sense of what directors are thinking, how they're feeling about things. Of course, you don't want things to get out of hand. You want a process that feels safe to the directors so that they're able and willing to participate earnestly so they can see the fruits of the process will actually improve their lives. But so balance this all out a little. You don't want a process that's so safe that they're just going through the motions and vice versa. Remember, if the process is so safe, that defeats the purpose of doing board evaluations at all. So what feels safe? Well, responding and writing to a questionnaire, that definitely should feel safe. So you should probably do something more than just a survey. Written questionnaires tend to result in a set of routine responses. So consider mixing up the written survey with individual interviews, one-on-one, or rely on oral discussions altogether. When people have something hard to say, it's easier to say it than to write it. I personally abhor numerical ratings or categories that correspond to a level of performance that are checked off. This is a 7, this is a 5. Not only do people interpret their own scales their own way, it really doesn't draw out the details of what you need to know. It doesn't flesh out those nuances. Another reason to use oral interviews rather than questionnaires is litigation risk. Be wary that written results are discoverable by someone, and maybe that someone will twist what was written and use it in a response in a way that the director didn't intend. So towards this end, when the evaluation process is complete, all materials related to the evaluation should head on over to the shredder. There's just some notes in the board materials that the evaluation happened, and here's the action plan that emanated from that. 2, breaking up is hard to do. Breaking up, Neil Sedaka, right? Peer evaluations are understandably unpopular because directors by nature don't want to rat each other out. It's difficult for directors to have frank conversations with each other about the possible need for somebody to move on. It's sort of a paradox that many directors have fired many people over the course of their career, but when it comes to kicking out a fellow director, to the curb, it's very hard to do. Perhaps they see themselves in the mirror that one day could be me getting the boot. And part of it might be the notion that it's common knowledge that good boards are collegial, so they have to behave in a collaborative way. And if they start pointing fingers at each other, that's to the that's to the detriment of being collegial. 3, pick the right person to facilitate. So the nominating/corporate governance committee oversees the board evaluation process, and the chair of that committee typically leads the way, acts as a facilitator. This person often is also the lead director. So in some cases, it could be the board chair who acts in this role rather than the governance chair. It depends on the board at that particular time. But sometimes a third party is brought in. Perhaps this happens every year or maybe once every few years. And that facilitator's role often includes writing up a questionnaire, conducting the oral interviews, summarizing the results, and then providing feedback and an action plan to the board as a group. The facilitator might also provide individual feedback to specific directors following a peer review. That's uncomfortable to do. And as part of making the process feel safe, it helps if the facilitator is someone that the directors trust. That's why bringing in a third party can help. If a director has an issue with another director on the board that otherwise, and that other director would be the person that would be conducting the interview, you're not going to get any honest feedback from that. So that doesn't mean that this third party facilitator has to be someone that at least one or more people on the board already knows. In fact, it might be better if it's someone that they don't. So most people decide within a minute of meeting someone whether they trust them. True, fact, intuition. So you want to hire a person that gives you that warm and fuzzy glow right off the bat, someone that you immediately feel comfortable, some kind of connection opening up to. You'll know it when you feel it. My intent is to not use outside law firms to facilitate. They tend not to do a great job. They're looking for repeat business. Well, any third-party facilitator would be looking for repeat business, but I hear that law firms tend to pull their punches more than others. And don't think that if a lawyer conducts the the oral interview that it's covered by attorney-client privilege. Don't bank on it. It's somewhat of an open question, and it probably does not work. And there's no reason to hire a lawyer to be their facilitator just for that reason. You might be shooting yourself in the foot. And a final word here on hiring a third-party facilitator. You get what you pay for. 4, change it up every few years. So it's good to change how you do your evaluation every few years, even if it's been working well. Even change up a great facilitator. You could always go back to that person after taking a break from that person for a year. You want to ensure that you're really getting at all the issues you should be. So refreshing the process helps to ensure you don't fall into the trap of everything's fine the way it is. Test that theory. Make sure you're right. 5, ask the right questions. Regardless of who is asking the questions should be geared towards understanding whether the board is adding value. Is our board adding long-term value and performance? Meaning that the question shouldn't be geared towards checking boxes. Let's ask this question because we always have. Just not going to elicit uncomfortable answers. You want to elicit some answers that you're not expecting. This doesn't mean that you necessarily need to dig into whether specific directors are doing their jobs properly, although that's an area sometimes that should be delved into. It does mean asking whether the board meetings are structured in a way that invites deep discussion, provokes directors to ask the hard questions. The solutions can be simple. It's as easy as rearranging how the boardroom is set up sometimes. Maybe we remove the board table altogether and get us into more of a campfire circle, at least once in a while for our board meetings. Adding more true discussion time to board meetings so directors can ask more questions, ensuring the right people are giving the right presentations in the right way. A common one is identifying topics that directors want to spend more time on over the next year, or the solutions might be complex or difficult to implement. We really need to replace about a third of the board. 6, ask open-ended questions. You're bound to get more meaningful information if directors are being asked open-ended questions like, tell me about anyone you think who's on the board who really adds value to the board, on this board or any other board you're on. And tell me what it is about them that you like, that you think that adds value. Or maybe it's, tell me about someone you think gets in the way of the board working effectively. Open-ended questions tend to elicit more detailed answers than if you ask narrow questions that elicit brief answers. It also provides better information compared to a 360-degree process where you're asking the opinion of how the board works from people that come into contact with the board. That type of process tends to be a waste of time in this context, in my opinion, because those people aren't in the boardroom all the time and they're not on the board. So what they think might not really matter that much for this purpose. It's pretty easy for boards to say everything is good, everything's effective, and we're doing a good job. If you're getting that pat answer year after year, that's a red flag that you need to revamp your evaluation process. Number 7, follow up to see if the process worked. So if the evaluation has not led to a healthy discussion about, do we have the right people on the board? What do we need for the future? Is there anything else that we might need to add? That type of overarching board refreshment analysis, that's a good indicator that your evaluation process needs work. Over the years, you'll probably notice a wide range of results. Some years, the follow-up might require some pretty drastic changes. Then you're likely to hit a lull after that. And if you need big changes every year, that's a sign of a bigger problem. But it's more likely that the opposite is experienced, that the board isn't clamoring for change. People resist change. And if you go years without the board evaluation process not winding up with a directive to institute major changes, that's a sign that big changes are actually necessary. The board is afraid to blow the whistle on itself. It's obvious that you need action on any recommendations that come from the evaluation process. So someone needs to be tapped with the responsibility to make sure execution actually happens. Let me end by noting that institutional investors are asking more questions about the nature of a board's evaluation these days. So some companies are starting to disclose some details about their board evaluation process in their proxy statement, such as how they've implemented certain changes as a result of their evaluation, or disclosing that they had a third party lead their evaluation. So look for my separate vid guide about disclosures about the board evaluation process, a link to which is beneath this video.